Hello and welcome to Season 11, Episode 1 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop,
I am Mark Bishop.
and this time we are reading J.R.R. Tolkien's The Monsters and the Critics and Other Essays. It's a collection of 7 essays from J.R.R. Tolkien, published or given throughout his academic career. And the first one that we'll be talking about today is Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics. And you were just saying before we started recording that you weren't really sure what you're going to say about this.
Well, I don't. So I'm not. This is a different type of book
Mhm.
than we've read before. I have not read Beowulf since high school.
Yeah, I was wondering how much you knew about Beowulf before we started reading this essay specifically about Beowulf.
About the meaning and context and of
Mhm.
Beowulf, and I mean, it was an interesting read. It's a meteor, not like a meteor, like things falling out of space,
Mhm.
but meteor meaning
More
it's
meaty.
more more of a meat.
Yeah, yes.
And like not an easy read.
Hmm.
So I had to like concentrate. I was trying to explain it to Sam. He was feigning interest.
Hmm.
Older brother who's home for a little while. Um, who just shakes his head, befuddled by your interests, and then my somewhat encouragement of your interests. But anyway, so it's like I have to concentrate because it was written. I guess
Hmm.
this essay. I'm trying to remember when
Yeah,
this essay.
this was delivered in 1936.
Yeah,
This was,
no,
yeah, in the forward, yeah, he mentions it's the Sir Israel Gollancz Memorial Lecture to the British Academy, read on 25th of November, 1936, and published in the Proceedings of the Academy later on. So, yeah, so delivered in 1936.
so I was correct. I mentioned the same. I think it was like written and presented in the 1930s.
Hmm.
So like the English, like even the spoken word in the 1930s. If you play old movies, they have a different like accent.
Hmm.
Really, there's like a English, um, European accent, like of
Right.
the wealthy class that is different and doesn't really exist
Hmm.
anymore, as far as I can tell. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe it does in some northeastern U.S. states, but so there's a different vocabulary, and
Right.
so
Well,
you
yeah,
have.
it's also just Tolkien being
Well,
himself,
that's what
right?
I
I
was
mean,
going
this
to
is just,
say. It's
yeah.
like that on steroids because
Hmm.
not only is it of that era, which is, quite frankly, the vocabulary is just so much stronger,
Hmm.
and so I'm used to reading at essentially a third grade level or a fifth grade level or whatever they
Right.
say the
Right.
years are, and then to read something that was written in the 1930s, and then on top of that it's Tolkien
Hmm.
and it's well written, but I just had to concentrate, use like more brain power than I'm used to,
Hmm.
just to really. I mean, it's not difficult to understand, but it's like for me when I'm reading, I like to just be, I like to not have to think about the words that I'm reading.
Hmm.
I want to be just taken away in the story, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
But if I don't have that vocabulary, if I'm not that fluent in it,
Hmm.
quite frankly, then I have to think about, okay, what is he saying? And then I have to
Right.
really understand it.
Right.
That's the kind of feel I got from this. I got better as it
Hmm.
kind of, moved on into the meat of it. But it
Right.
was an interesting discussion. But like I felt like I kind of want to read Beowulf again,
Hmm.
but it really
Well,
was.
Tolkien has a translation that you can buy that I have on my shelf. I should actually bring that over here. But yeah,
I can't buy any more books.
I
I
don't have
have
that problem.
I well, I mean, I can, but I mean,
Yes.
I'm allowed to, and I have
Hmm.
the money to, but I'm refusing my instincts to buy more books. Although I just bought another book, 3 books last week,
There
uh,
you go.
and well, 2 of them anyway. Um, I bought a biography of McKinley.
Hmm.
Did I tell you that story? Yeah, I
Yeah,
told
yeah,
you
you told
about
me
it
that.
when
Yeah,
when I
not on
bought
the
it.
podcast, but yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, what's the name of that bookstore? It's not Dunaway. I went to Dunaway
Hmm.
bookstore. They had a McKinley biography, but it was one of those. It was written. He was a president, got killed or
Hmm.
assassinated, and so this was like a memorial book, and so it was obviously a tribute to him. And I didn't really want that because I wanted something. I mean, I don't know if it's honest or not, but then I found the book. It was a long story at that
Right.
other rather odd bookstore. Anyway, So, how do you want to handle like going through this? How do you
Hmm.
want to describe it? It's a little bit different format that we've done before. We're not
Right.
using, I assume it's just a jumping off point,
Hmm.
because these are Tolkien's essays and speeches,
Right.
and like this one,
Hmm.
the text of it is like 33 pages
Right.
in the book, and then it has an appendix and some other
Hmm.
explanatory notes. So, how do you want to handle
Right.
talking about it on the podcast?
Well, I mean, I figure we can kind of just go through as best we can. I don't know if you had anything you even highlighted or wanted to make
Oh
note
yeah.
of as you usually do. But yeah, I mean, I know a little bit about like the background of this. So like, yeah, as you mentioned, and sort of his main point throughout here is like all of the scholarship at the time that he's writing has kind of completely cast out Beowulf like as a good poem in and of itself.
Mhm.
Right, and those are the critics and the monsters that he's talking about. Really, is that it was seen purely for like historical purposes or for philological purposes, and really just as a poem, it doesn't really work. It's weird. It's sort of strange. It's this sort of bizarre example of this Christian poet trying to emulate pagan sort of events and narratives and fairy tale and stuff like that, and kind of failing. Like that was sort of the predominant view at the time, and the idea was that really, if you want to study Beowulf, you study Beowulf for the example that it gives us of the history, of Anglo-Saxon culture, or as just examples of Old English. And so this essay actually just like completely revolutionized like the field of Beowulf studies. Like there is, kind of unknown to a lot of people who know Tolkien just for the Lord of the Rings, but he was super influential with this essay, especially on like how people approached this poem. Because there's like before Tolkien and then after Tolkien, and after Tolkien things like completely change with the whole treatment of the poem, and that's just like kind of accepted in the whole field.
So you have his translation of Beowulf. What
Yes,
I guess we should probably what is your impression
yes.
of the actual Beowulf
Well,
poem?
how about I go grab that really quick, and you
Sure.
can fill the time while I'm not at the microphone.
Well, can you hear me when you're not at the microphone? I guess not. He just took off his headphones. He's walking towards a back shelf book. He was bragging before we started this podcast about how he picked up some ancient books
That's
from
right. Yes,
it was a what is the New
and
Testament in Greek?
the Old Testament.
Old
I
Testament.
already have the New Testament in Greek. I've
Oh,
had
I
that for a while. But yeah,
apologize.
the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament from 1948, or not 1940, 1848.
Yes,
St. Augustine's Confessions in Latin from 1838. A 5-volume set of the Summa Theologica from
that's pretty cool.
1887 to 89, I think, and then the complete works of Virgil from like 1907.
Interesting.
Anybook.com. Great website.
Okay, I'll
Um,
check that out.
Yes. But yeah, no, I have Tolkien's translation. This wasn't actually published during his life. This was published later. And his translation is kind of strange, right? Because, he talks, throughout this whole thing about, sort of how this is a great example of a poem. His translation is in prose, not in verse. So he did not give at least in this published form, he did not give a poetic version of the narrative. He did sort of rewrite. He had this project where he was kind of rewriting, yeah, the lay of Beowulf sort of in his own version in modern English as a poem. And that's sort of tucked away at the back of this edition of Beowulf that I have after his Selleck spell as well. But yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I think this was the first that I read the story of Beowulf was in his translation, in this sort of prose translation. I really enjoy it. I think it's great as a story for anyone who doesn't know the story. Yeah, Beowulf, the king, the Anglo-Saxon king, goes to help the Danes who are being attacked by this monster Grendel. So he kills Grendel, and then he has to kill Grendel's mother. And then we sort of like jump ahead to when he's an elderly king. And there's a dragon sort of attacking the kingdom, and he ends up killing the dragon. But then, as he kills the dragon, he's also killed. So it's a story of
That's a
sort of
spoiler
heroism.
alert. I
Yes,
guess. Yeah.
well, I mean, it's been around for 1,400 years or something, maybe longer than that. It's an old poem.
Oh, I'd forgotten that part of it. Now I know how it ends. Um, I guess I don't know. My interest in reading it just gone down.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Um, but I'm sure it would have come back to me at some point. Anyway, so what? But that's a good explanation of what it is.
Mhm.
Do you think it's a good poem or good story?
No, I think it's great. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. I mean, I don't read Old English, unfortunately, so I can't speak to how it is in the original. But I mean, Tolkien's translation is great, and I've read one other, blanking on the last name, first name Seamus Haney, I think is his name, as another translation that's pretty good. But you know, it's a very entertaining story, and it's very important, sort of just in English history, and even in American history. There's like there was an interest with a lot of the founding fathers in a specifically like Anglo-Saxon idea. I forget who it was who proposed that Hengist and Horsa should be on like the seal of the United States. And those were like the first two like Anglo-Saxon kings. They were the twin kings of the Jutes, and they were the first to come over into England from Europe, and sort of mingled with the Celts. And they were like the first like Anglo-Saxon kings. And so there is this idea that like you know this Anglo-Saxon heritage is very important in sort of like modern European history and Western history.
All right, interesting. Okay, so so this is story, epic. I guess he's arguing it's not really an epic
Yeah,
poem.
right.
There's this a poem about the story of Beowulf, which I think didn't he say it originates like possibly around year 500
Hmm.
AD, I
Yeah,
guess,
yeah.
or that time frame.
Hmm.
And so tell me if I'm wrong, but I think he's making the argument like I guess maybe you already said this, but you know, like it had been studied as almost like an artifact, like a
Hmm.
story or whatever,
Right.
and it's interesting because of the language used.
Hmm.
But he's saying, well, really, this should be looked at as art,
Hmm.
like a painting or a sculpture would be. You know, it really is a brilliant melding
Hmm.
of these old epic tales,
Right.
but infused with some Christian themes.
Hmm.
Isn't that what he's really part of what he's
Yes.
saying or no?
Yes. So, yeah, what he's saying is he's criticizing, yeah, this idea, you know, kind of as I mentioned earlier, right? So the Beowulf poet was a Christian, right? And so this is written after, you know, the Anglo-Saxons had been Christianized. So he's kind of looking back at a pagan past that he's no longer a part of, right? And so it's kind of useful that they say, like, as a historical lens to view sort of what the prevailing ideas were and sort of what was still going on at the time. But really, a lot of the critics were saying like it's a pale imitation of maybe some of the Latin sources that had come up to sort of you know Northern Europe there. I think in particular he draws the comparison like some were saying, well, it's just so much worse than like the Aeneid, for example. And one of their big criticisms of the critics was that it focuses too much on the monsters, right? There should be a more human element. Right, they say, well, in Aeneid, you do have, you know, Polyphemus, you know, the Cyclops, but you also have, you know, this big war, you know, once he, you know, gets to Rome or nearly to Rome. And it's this idea that's like, well, there should have been more of that in Beowulf, that there should have been, you know, you can't have monsters in both halves, right? You can have Grendel and Grendel's mother in the first half, but then you should have like a human war. Why do you bring the dragon into things? This is sort of a trivial thing. It's not really well written. It's not well structured. But he says he's really trying to defend the monsters, or the existence of the monsters in Beowulf.
Well, and he makes and I guess maybe I should just kind of ask you questions about your thoughts about some of this stuff because he makes a comparison between the Greek gods and like the Norse gods,
Right.
where the Greek gods were more eternal characters, meaning that they didn't really have, well, they might have had a beginning, you know, way back when, but they were considered like eternal characters, and so they had more of an ethereal or a godlike, so to
Hmm.
speak, presence. But the gods or these kind of almost spiritual powers or whatever, and the northern European stories were mortal,
Hmm.
and so can I give them a different flavor? Am I reading that right, or do you even know I'm referencing there? I can
Yeah,
find it.
yeah. No, that's right, more or less. I mean, there's still some amount of like deification of gods. They're not like, you know, 100% the same as humans, but with a lot of like the Nordic, you know, mythology and stuff like that, you don't really have humans figuring into things at all. And so like a lot of the you know, human elements or the mortal elements are from the gods. Like if you read the Eddas, like the poetic Edda, which is, you know, one of our biggest sources for Norse mythology, humans don't really play into it at all. Like there's a brief story of like the creation of humanity, but then most of the stuff is on the gods. And like their interactions and sort of the categories are a little weird in Norse mythology, but also like the dwarves and the elves in Norse mythology. But humans really are kind of side characters. And so you don't have like this big contrast between human and God like you do have in like the Greek and Roman sense of things, where it's, they're so much higher and they're sort of, on their own level, completely distant, but can interact with the humans in some ways. So yeah, yeah. In the northern European sort of mindset, it's not this very distant thing. At least that's the point that Tolkien's arguing.
Yeah, and then he mentions that it's kind of important in the way he views this story in
Hmm.
that it seems like for what he was saying, or maybe I misunderstood it, but that like the evil forces, these
Hmm.
monsters, are more eternal than the god type creatures, and so it's like there's more of a struggle of the gods and their human recruits
Hmm.
against these monsters.
Right.
You know,
Well, I mean,
is it
there's no there's no gods in Beowulf.
mm,
There is God. God is referenced as in the Christian God, and there's references to Cain and Abel, and so it's like this fully Christianized thing. And so that's what one of the reasons the critics are like disappointed in Beowulf is that you don't get like any of like the purer mythological elements that they were hoping for in sort of examining the poem.
okay? Because he was I guess he was referencing just the Norse gods
Hmm.
in that part of
But
this.
yeah,
Okay,
it's the same sort of sphere of ideas up there.
okay. So I did have I had a question about there's page 9.
Hmm.
He's
Well, I'm
talking.
gonna before we go to page 9, I want to
Mhm.
read. I think there's this fantastic allegory that he gives, and I think this is actually much more applicable to many other things. Starting at the bottom of
Wait,
page 7.
wait. I want to. I have a new favorite word.
All right.
Jabberwocks.
Hmm.
For it is of their nature that the jabberwocks of historical and antiquarian research burble in the tulgey wood of conjecture, flitting from one tum-tum tree to another. I just like how he turns a phrase in that.
Hmm.
I've never heard the word jabberwock.
Well, that's a reference to Alice in Wonderland.
Is it
That's
really?
yeah, yeah, the Jabberwocky, right? Like
Huh.
the monster in Alice in Wonderland. And so I think he's making the point that yeah, the Jabberwocks of historical and Green research, like the monsters are sort of trivial. They're childish. They're off in these woods over there, and we shouldn't really focus on them as much.
Interesting. Okay. So what were your? I'm sorry, I interrupted your point. What were you?
Yes. Well, I was just going to read this allegory that starts in the bottom of page 7. I think this is really important. It says, a man inherited a field in which was an accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stones, some had already been used in building the house in which he actually lived, not far from the old house of his fathers. Of the rest, he took some and built a tower. But his friends coming perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over with no little labor in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or to discover whence the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material. Some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it and forgot even the stones. They all said, this tower is most interesting, but they also said, after pushing it over, what a muddle it is in. And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, he is such an odd fellow. Imagine his using these old stones just to build a nonsensical tower. Why did not he restore the old house? He had no sense of proportion. But from the top of that tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea. Right, and so he's using this as a reference for the whole state of Beowulfiana, I think is the word he uses, is sort of Beowulf criticism. But it's like they're so determined to pull apart every single element of the thing to uncover what might be there, that they don't actually consider the thing as a whole. Right, they don't see the thing for its beauty. They don't see the thing for what it's actually worth. And I think apply that writ large to all of society, where you're just constantly trying to atomize every single thing, where it's like, well, this institution really doesn't exist at all. It's really just this thing, this idea that we had that was passed down from this person, and this person had this idea, and it's like, okay, we were just missing the whole thing. You're destroying the thing, and you're not recognizing what its actual purpose is or was, in the hope of some sort of historical point that you're trying to make.
By the way, I had highlighted that
Good.
thing too. I just got this book yesterday, so I read this today. This part of it today, so I can't say I've given a whole lot of thought to it, but there's a lot to that little story, that
Hmm.
little allegory. That there's so much there because it's not just. that he built the tower and the house, but he
Hmm.
built the tower and the house from the ruins of an old
Right.
kingdom, basically, like
Hmm.
an old castle, an old building. But he didn't rebuild it. He built something different and maybe better or at
Hmm.
least different. And it served his purpose and would have served everybody's purpose to be able to look upon the sea in this
Hmm.
tower. There's nothing to say that the tower was not suitable for whatever purposes a tower would be. I just think it's a really interesting story, and especially in our American society, where
Right.
things get torn down and built back up anew. I mean, we're always, what they call creative destruction, but I think we've accelerated that. So quite often, like the part of the story where the people, the characters tear down the tower, push it over to look at it, to examine how
Hmm.
flawed it was as
Right.
a structure. But of course, they destroyed it in examining it. It just seems um, it has a lot of meaning for a lot of different issues. I just thought that was a
Yeah.
really brilliant little snippet of a story, and
Yeah.
I think you really probably write a PhD thesis on that
Oh yeah, for sure.
paragraph right there.
Well, I was thinking just kind of one example of that, when I was reading this is like marriage, right? Where it's like, you see people all the time criticizing sort of the concept of marriage. Well, so much of marriage ends in divorce, and what about, the rates of this and this terrible thing that happens? And those are the same people who are kind of on the side of things that destroyed the whole institution of marriage, starting in the 60s. Like, well, look at how terribly formed it is. Look, it doesn't actually serve any purpose. It's so awful. And they were the same people cheering for the downfall of marriage, back in the 60s and into the 70s. Right. And it's like that same thing. They didn't see the full tower when it was up. They destroyed it and then criticized it and said it wasn't worth anything.
Yeah, I guess the people in the '60s or '70s that destroyed marriage are darn near close to their deathbeds now. I mean, we were talking
That's
about
true.
the boomers and maybe the boomers' parents.
Right.
Um, yeah, but now it's been fully destroyed, and I don't want to go down this path too much, but I've been very critical of the boomers for a long time.
Hmm.
But then I look at the how much my generation, Generation X, has just finished the job.
Yeah.
The boomers, kneecapped society, and then we just did the coup de grace on this helpless husk
Right.
of all that is good in our country, by just taking it to the extreme of uh, abortion on demand at will, and divorce on demand and at will, and for really no good reason, and then everything else.
Hmm.
So now I'm starting to get down on my own generation, but we have yet to have power yet.
Mm.
So but I think we might skip it if JD Vance. I think JD Vance he's below us, right? He's in his 40s.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I guess, would he be like on
So
the upper end of millennial?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, wow.
Kamala would have been a Generation X.
Mm. Yeah. That wouldn't have been a good look for you guys.
That's about right. So let's not get on that thing.
Mhm.
So I did have other questions, unless you wanted to had other thoughts that you want. I mean, I know there are other thoughts, but I had some questions that I had a little question. I'll give you a second.
I'm
Let me,
I'm rushing you. I'm just
um,
sitting here. Well, while you're looking for something, I'll make a point here. Um, well, that's all right. Um, but yeah, no, because right after he gives that whole example, I really like how he kind of structures things after that, because he just gives this huge long list of completely contradictory conclusions on what Beowulf is. He says, Beowulf is a half-baked native epic, the development of which was killed by Latin learning. It was inspired by emulation of Virgil. So, of course, those two things are completely at odds. And it is a product of the education that came in with Christianity. It is feeble and incompetent as a narrative, or the rules of narrative are cleverly observed in the manner of the learned epic. It is the confused product of a committee of muddle-headed and probably beer-bemused Anglo-Saxons, or it is a string of pagan lays edited by monks. And he goes on and on. He spends like a really long paragraph just saying, look at how many different opinions are, and they're completely contradictory. And so there's really no good sense of what this whole thing is. So many people have sort of picked it apart and tried to make a different point with, the stones that they've left sort of lying around, that you don't really have a cohesive idea of what this thing even is anymore.
yes, and he says this one sentence on the top of page 10 that I thought was really, really very Tolkienish. He's talking about like these really brilliant writers
Hmm.
that are picking apart different things. And he mentions how wonderful they are at all the big issues. But he says the dwarf on the spot sometimes sees things missed by the traveling giant ranging many countries.
Yeah.
And it's such a Tolkien thing to think about because I'm surprised you wouldn't say a hobbit,
Hmm.
like just a simple folk that are smaller in notoriety or maybe even stature will see some better meaning or higher meaning than somebody who is a giant in their field
Right.
or in society, bounding upon from place to place and epic interesting topics.
Right.
And I just thought that was really
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, this is pre-Hobbit. This is a year before the publication of The Hobbit in
Well, he
37.
would have created them though.
Well, yes, but that would have
He wouldn't
made
have.
no sense to
Yeah,
a
right.
single person in the audience. What is this guy talking about?
The media family might understand.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Did you
Uh,
find the question that you had? But no, no, I agree with you about yeah, that was a great
I
quote.
think you answered it earlier. It was about this. Oh darn it! Now I got to get back to it. It was a reference to a court of Heorot, Heorot.
Heorot. That's
Heorot.
that's the hall in which a lot of the action happens. So that's where Beowulf travels to, where the king of the Danes is at, and that's where Grendel attacks during the night. Is in the hall of Heorot.
So like I'm at 29, it says, but of
Oh wow.
course, without the first half, we should miss much incidental illustration. We should miss also the dark background of the court of Heorot that loomed as large in glory and doom in ancient northern imagination as the court of Arthur. Okay. All right. So that
Yes.
that explains
Oh,
that.
that's good. That's
I would
good.
have to I'd have to read Beowulf again to remember what there, or I could have Googled it, but again, I was short on time.
Right.
So I really there were a number of different quotes in that
Hmm.
excerpt. I thought they were pretty good. Um, he has a lot of praise for the actual author, who I
Hmm.
guess nobody really knows who the
Yeah,
author is.
completely unnamed. He's just referred to as the Beowulf poet. We have no idea who actually wrote it. No name
But
given.
but he's drawn a number of conclusions that this person was really brilliant
Hmm.
and had some as you mentioned Christian influences referencing I guess Cain
Right.
uh, and all that and he mentions he talks about the critics of it. He says there's something irritatingly odd about all of this. And he talks. He says one. And this is on page 13. One even dares to wonder if something has gone wrong with quote our modern judgment, supposing it is justly represented. And he talks about how you know it was this whoever wrote it. He presumes it's a man. It's probably a safe assumption. Um, but there was a poetic talent. And he says the high tone, the sense of dignity alone is evidence in Beowulf of the presence of a mind lofty and thoughtful.
Hmm.
So he's really praising the author for the artistry and the creation of this poem
Hmm.
as a poem. Not only does the story, but the like the literary nature of it, which I thought was really interesting.
Right. Yeah, no, that's it's very true, and I think we'll get that next time. The next article is called "On Translating Beowulf." So he talks really about the actual composition of a lot of the phrases there. But yeah, he makes the point. I forget if it's in here, if it's in the appendix to this essay, that it's really an entirely different sort of style of poetry than a lot of these critics would be used to, sort of in the Latin and Greek tradition, which is based on sort of the feet and the weight of the feet and sort of in a set pattern for the full poem. He says, with Beowulf, it's and with this Anglo-Saxon poetry, it's this sort of weird. Well, he wouldn't say weird. I think he thinks it's pretty great. Where you're sort of balancing the weight. You sort of split each line into halves, and so the balance on the left half sort of has to match the balance on the right half, and it's this whole complicated system of meter. I think I'll talk about that in the next essay, though. Um, but yeah, no, because I think yeah, that point about the our modern judgment, thinking that it's so superior, right, is sort of referencing, you mentioned this a little earlier. He quotes Kerr, who's an earlier Beowulf scholar. He says, talking about Beowulf, this is Kerr's voice. He says, "Yet with this radical defect, a disproportion that puts the irrelevances in the center and the serious things in the outer edges, the poem of Beowulf is undeniably weighty. The thing itself is cheap. The moral and the spirit of it can only be matched among the noblest authors."
Yes.
So it's like, why would you not focus on the more important topics? You know, what we want to know about
Yeah.
sort of either the gods or sort of the more human history that's going on. Why spend so much time writing about monsters? Why is this the focus of this poem? And I think it's he's kind of making the point that the critics want something other than what exists, right? They're
Yeah.
sort of wishing that it was something completely different than what it is, and so they're just missing the entire point of the thing.
Yeah, and well, I think yeah, he's talking about that. I think on 15,
Hmm.
he's talking about, and this is something I think you address, and I read your, I didn't get through your whole paper,
Mm.
but the one that you presented recently. But he mentions on 15 towards the bottom, very close to the bottom. It says, "For myth is alive at once in all its parts and dies before it can be dissected." So it, like the mythological story, as I read what he's saying, is that if you try to pick it apart, it's going to disappear or die before you're able to
Right.
even do that. And he mentions that above that is it is at its best when it's presented by a poet who feels rather than makes explicit what his theme portends. And I think that's really a good way to describe artistic writing.
Right.
That you're not gonna you don't have to say everything out loud, and that's I think that's my criticism of a lot of modern movies in
Hmm.
particular. It's like of course part of it is that they just want to have make everything explicit, like
Hmm.
and not just stated but like shown, because they're like a great suspense love story example that I think is a great movie is North by Northwest.
Hmm.
Well, there's a romantic affair that occurs there, but you don't see any of it.
Right.
But it's shown in how they interact with each other, both before and after their coupling, I guess you'd say. And so I think there's so much in movies that's better left unsaid. And I've become a really big fan of Sicario, which
Mm.
is a movie about I don't know if you've ever seen it. Have you ever seen
You've
Sicario?
mentioned it. I don't think I've seen it.
It's a brooding movie, and there's so much not said. So like when it's not just in the dialogue, but in the action or kind of just present there, you could watch it a second time and say, "Oh, that's an interesting theme." And so I've become I've always been a big fan of movies that have a lot less dialogue.
Right.
Like the old Clint Eastwood movies are famous for the westerns are famous for very little dialogue,
Hmm.
and you don't necessarily completely understand everything, but you get a sense that there's this history there,
Right.
and then it kind of dribs and drabs, and it's almost like a mystery that you're being solved.
Yeah.
But it sounds like Tolkien is kind of alluding to that sort of type of writing, that type of artistry, where you're not, just because you don't say everything,
Hmm.
explain it in detail for the reader, it makes it more of an art than if you did. But
Right.
yeah,
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 I think he's making that point, but he's also, I think, making another point too. That's actually one of my sort of gripes with the linguistics field, where it's like you don't really pay any attention to the art of a thing. You're trying to break down all of language into as basic component parts, categorize everything into rules. It's all sort of this mental process,
mhm,
and a lot of that is true. It helps us to understand how language works for sure. But, linguists never, read or talk about poetry, right?
mhm,
Linguists talk almost exclusively about, natural sort of produced speech and conversation, right? And that's
yeah,
sort of like the baseline for trying to work out like the underlying rules of language, and sort of analyzing that and sort of breaking that down if it's as natural as it can possibly be with sort of no beauty, no art really considered in the thing. And I think even if linguists did read a lot of poetry and discuss a lot of poetry, I think they would fall into the critics, exactly that Tolkien's describing, that they don't see the whole poem, they don't see any beauty in it, they're trying to dissect it into its component parts.
yeah.
And a lot of the critics that he's addressing are like the exact counterparts or the predecessors to the modern linguistics field. So I think it is sort of apt there.
It kind of reminds me of like if you're studying logic, like logic and language, you can diagram an argument, but that doesn't mean that you can be persuasive.
Right.
You know, there's an art to persuasion
Right.
and a talent to it that's different than just being mathematically precise.
Hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He also makes a point earlier in this paragraph that's important. He talks about this in the appendix. I know you didn't read that, but maybe I'll make a couple of mentions of that later. But he says, Doom is held less literary than hamartia. That's where that Greek word is up there. I figured you
Yes.
might not catch this because, as far as I know, you don't read Greek. But hamartia is the Greek word for sin. And it actually comes from an archery term. To miss the mark is really where that word comes from. So you've sort of
That's
failed,
I
you've
have a
missed the mark.
question mark right next to that
Yes, yeah.
because I have that underlined because it is anyway. Yes.
Yes.
Good.
But yeah, he makes the point, kind of a little later in the appendix as well, that there's this sort of different value system that's present that we can see in Beowulf compared to, either the Greek or the sort of Christian literature from, a lot, usually from farther south in Europe. It's this idea that, doom is very important in doom in the sense of sort of not doom and sort of despair and hopelessness. Doom in its original meaning, he mentions this a little bit later. It's like the noble pagan's desire for the merited praise of the noble, right? That's what doom in its sort of origin means, and through that, then we get this sort of idea of fate as well. The sort of desire for praise leading to fate, and then doom. Eventually, we get in sort of modern English as sort of like despair and horror and stuff like that. The end times and death and stuff like that. Because like yeah, in this sort of literary criticism field, you don't have this sense of discussing these sort of more Germanic ideas, I guess you could call them.
Yeah, and he talks about that specifically, and I thought this is like he's explaining like his themes of Lord of the Rings,
Hmm.
in my estimation. And about on page 17, he says, "Let us by all means esteem the old heroes, men caught in the chains of circumstances or of their own character, torn between duties equally sacred, dying with their backs to the wall."
Hmm.
And that to me was like a lot of the themes in the Lord of the Rings,
Right.
what's his name, Boromir, um, you know, which was a circumstance of his character trying to take the ring, and
Right.
then being a really heroic figure,
Hmm.
both before and after that. And every one of the characters, it was both a victim of their own decisions, but also subject to the circumstances they're put in,
Right.
and then they had to make decisions to either be a hero or to recoil or run
Right.
away from them. You
Right.
know, and
I think that was, almost, at least when he was first writing, a lot of his Silmarillion type stuff before he began The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. That was like almost explicitly his intention, right? Was to have this sort of like pre-Christian. Well, I mean, he references that in one of his letters when he first started writing the stories that would become the Silmarillion. He says that he was writing a mythology for England because he said, England doesn't really have its own sort of native mythology. Like you have the kind of the Arthurian stuff, but even Beowulf, which is sort of like one of the earliest, or really the earliest sort of examples of English, mythology, that's already Christianized. So you don't have any pre-Christian elements of sort of mythology. So this sort of pre-Christian world with these sort of noble virtues, right? These weren't, these horrible evil pagans and stuff like that. Not the type that were making human sacrifices and stuff like that. They still had some sense of virtue, but it's this sort of pre-Christian concept of it, and that's sort of the at least sort of the feeling that he was putting into a lot of those early Silmarillion type stuff, and that sort of carries on into The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings for sure.
I think the main problem with any sort of like mythology in Old England before the Anglo-Saxons came over is because they were probably all illiterate, pagan, violent, um, occult type
There's a high likelihood of that.
societies.
Yeah, yeah.
Societies,
Yes.
so
Yeah.
I remember I saw like a meme or some short video about somebody that was from Denmark, maybe, was kind of given a funny look because people in England were saying they've never been uh, uh, they've never been invaded or conquered by
Mm,
anybody. Wait, what? Yeah, actually, England was conquered
hmm.
by Anglo-Saxons.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean that because that's going back to the Lord of the Rings. It's kind of both things at once because he says in a different letter, just fundamentally a Catholic and religious work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously so in the revision, talking
Mm.
specifically about the Lord of the Rings. So it's sort of like that feeling of sort of like the noble pagan, but fundamentally in all of its values, it is Catholic. It is fundamentally Catholic, drawing on a Catholic worldview. And that's essentially what the Beowulf poet is also doing, right? He is a Christian author trying to write about sort of this noble pagan past, but he's never going to escape the Christian worldview. He was never in that pagan world. We kind of assume he was born a Christian, and so it's sort of that same thing, that it is in some ways fundamentally Christian, even if it's sort of giving like a glimpse to the pagan world.
And kind of feeding off of that, where he's talking about the use of the monster characters
Mm,
in that
right.
those themes. And I like this quote in 19. He says, "I would suggest then that the monsters are not an inexplicable blunder of taste. They are essential, fundamentally allied to the underlying ideas of the poem, which give it its lofty tone and high seriousness." Or he's got responding to critics that act like it's some sort of silly fairy tale to have
Hmm.
a dragon, and the dragon isn't dragon enough. It was not a fairy tale type dragon character.
Hmm.
So I think it's just interesting how he fleshes that out,
Right.
and he's talking about the monsters being in this story being different and more important, and actually provide it with a higher tone because you're struggling against these monsters.
Hmm.
Or the character is, going through the themes of the book, but or the poem. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's sort of his main point. And I think the paragraph before that is important too. I'll read a good portion of this. He says, Beowulf is not then the hero of an heroic lay precisely. He has no enmeshed loyalties nor hapless love. He is a man, and that for him and many is sufficient tragedy. Kind of addressing the point, well, there's no tragedy, it's just a guy going around fighting monsters. Well, no, he's human. That is tragedy enough. He says, it is not an irritating accident that the tone of the poem is so high and its theme so low. It is the theme and its deadly seriousness that begets the dignity of tone. I'll try to read this, old English here. My pronunciation probably isn't good. He says, Lifus lana el skakad leot and lif somod. So deadly and ineluctable is the underlying thought that those who in the circle of light within the besieged hall are absorbed in work or talk and do not look to the battlements, either do not regard it or recoil. Death comes to the feast and they say he gibbers. He has no sense of proportion. Right, and the Anglo-Saxon there, I don't know the second half of that phrase, but leaf is lana, that literally means life is on loan, right? Life is sort of borrowed, right? And so it's you're sort of in this tiny circle of light, and that's one of the main themes throughout the essay. That it's these, especially in the Hall of Heorot, right? And sort of these guys camping out in the hall, and you have this monster that attacks every night, sort of coming out of the darkness. This very real sense for these pagan Germanic peoples that there is a very scary world outside, and life is on loan, right? And you can either and people are sort of ignoring the danger, right? They're tucked inside the hall, they're trying to stay within the light, and out of the dark this monster comes, and that's where he's saying, this is what gives it its lofty tone and high seriousness. It's this tiny circle of light surrounded by this dangerous dark world that they're trying to make sense of, surrounded by danger.
yes, excellent. I think we've covered it. What do
You
you
think
think?
so?
Anything else? Yeah. Do you think there's anything else we need to talk
I
about?
mean, I think there's a lot more, and I could talk
Oh,
about
okay.
this.
Well, then go.
Yes. Well, I'll have to remind myself what exactly I wanted to talk about. Um, but
Well, here I'll go on. Like I mentioned, his praise for the author and the poem
mhm,
itself. On 26, he
mm,
says he's describing it, and he says it is a poem by a learned man writing of old times, who looking back on the heroism and sorrow feels in them something permanent and something symbolical,
mm.
which I think he's writing about the author of Beowulf, but anybody could be writing that about Tolkien.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And I wonder if he's in his own way trying to emulate that storytelling and what he wrote.
Mm.
I suspect he was.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I found another point that I want to mention here on page 22, not to drag us back too far, but talking about, the Christianity present in here and how that interplays with things. He says, the monsters had been the foes of the gods, the captains of men, and within time the monsters would win. In the heroic siege and last defeat, men and gods alike had been imagined in the same host. Now, the heroic figures, the men of old, Halath under Heofnum, that's heroes under heaven, remained and still fought on until defeat. For the monsters do not depart, whether the gods go or come. A Christian was, and is, still like his forefathers, immortal, hemmed in the hostile world. The monsters remain the enemies of mankind, the infantry of the old war, and became inevitably the enemies of the one God, Eketritan, the eternal captain of the new. So like, just because, there's a new society that's grown up since the pagan times, the monsters, the danger is still very real, right? We shouldn't just discard this thing as being completely useless to a Christian audience, right? This is still very relevant. These themes are still very important, right? The world didn't just become immediately safe because now we're in Christian times, right? The world is still dangerous, and you would do well to remember that.
Yeah. And I think that leads into a good quote I have from page 31.
Oh, there we go.
Or he says, he's talking about, the use of the monster theme in a dragon. He says, but for the universal significance which is given to the fortunes of its hero, it is an enhancement and not a detraction. In fact, it is necessary that his final foe should not be some Swedish prince or a treacherous friend, but a dragon, a thing
Mm.
made by imagination for just such a purpose. I thought that was a great way to look at that that type of use of a story character, like a dragon or an evil spirit or something. It makes it bigger if it's not just, hey, some friend, committed treason against you or
Mhm.
betrayed you in some way.
Right.
It's something broader or more meaningful. And his point is that the critics are missing that kind of
Mhm.
more thematic element rather than just, oh, it's a story between two guys fighting over a princess or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And on the page before, going back to the meter point, this is what I was referencing. He says the lines do not go according to a tune; they are founded on a balance, an opposition between two halves of roughly equivalent phonetic weight and significant content, which are more often rhythmically contrasted than similar. They are more like masonry than music. In this fundamental fact of poetic expression, I think there's a parallel to the total structure of Beowulf. Beowulf is indeed the most successful Old English poem because in it the elements, language, meter, theme, structure are almost nearly in harmony. Judgment of the verse has often gone astray through listening for an accentual rhythm and pattern, and it seems to halt and stumble. And he goes on and talks about, well, the theme seems trivial and stuff like that. He says, well, it's none of those things. It's this very sort of solid, grounded thing. And this is what you completely lose when you're trying to break it apart, when you're turning over the stones and destroying the tower, right?
Yeah.
You've completely removed the masonry. And again, not to keep harping on linguists, but that's the same thing I see, is that you're completely lacking an idea of the whole. You need to figure out the whole thing. Just dissecting it piece by piece isn't really going to get you anywhere ultimately.
Yeah, and I think at the end of that paragraph, he says it approaches rather to a sculpture or painting.
Hmm.
It is a composition, not a tune.
Right.
And I think that is the conclusion of what you're saying there.
Mhm.
You have to look at it as it's almost like a symphony where you could listen to the flautist, the flute
Mhm.
player
Flautist, yeah.
separately, and the violinist separately, and the whoever has the big gong, I think it's a percussionist. But when you put it all together, it's a symphony.
Right.
It's a composition rather than just some flute playing Pied
Right.
Piper.
True.
And then didn't Pied Piper play a flute?
Oh, he played a pipe.
I guess that's right.
Yeah.
He's a piper.
I think it's
I
in
guess
his
the
name.
difference. I guess the difference between a pipe and a flute.
Uh-huh.
The flute has the hole in the side of it, and the pipe has like a little reed or something.
Yes. Well, I think a pipe is usually played like down, right?
Yeah,
You have it
the
like in front of
flute.
your, like a vertical line in front
Yes,
of you.
as
If you
opposed to
vision it.
horizontal.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, yes.
I
But I
said
could
the
be wrong.
same thing, but you described it differently.
Oh, I
So you're
apologize.
blowing into the side, the length of the flute,
Mm-hmm.
but you're blowing through the tube directly in a pipe, right?
Maybe. I'm sure there's different types of pipes.
I think they're all that way. And I think is,
Maybe.
is there a because if you do it differently, it has to do with the type of blowing through the
Mm.
tube.
Maybe.
Tube.
Yeah. I don't know. Although I feel like I've seen pipers playing like that too. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah.
Flautist.
Yes. Maybe one of our many listeners who is a piper could contact us and clarify.
By the way, have you tried to smoke the pipe that I sent you back home with or back
No,
in
I
Canada?
haven't actually. It's been sitting on my shelf for a while.
Me too. I keep moving, but it's been cold.
Yes.
I
Well,
don't
I
know
don't have
what's.
any tobacco.
Oh, I thought you took some with you.
No, I didn't.
Oh,
But yeah, back to the
they
to the
sell that in
essay.
Florida, I think.
Oh yes, I'm sure they do. Um, but yes, back to the essay. I mean, we're kind of here at the end. But I wanted to talk, as he kind of
You can
wraps
tell
up
by
here.
I'm getting distracted by other.
Yes.
I just start talking about things that I think are interesting.
Yes. But yeah, he makes this point in sort of the last paragraph of the essay, like even when it was written, it was sort of antiquarian, right? It was never really like an immediate, capturing of, the time, right? It was this Christian poet sort of looking back in the past. He says, there's not much poetry in the world like it. Here, I'm going to go actually a bit further up. He says, if the funeral of Beowulf moved once like the echo of an ancient dirge, far off and hopeless, it is to us as a memory brought over the hills, an echo of an echo. There's not much poetry in the world like this, and though Beowulf may not be among the very greatest poems of our Western world and tradition, it has its own individual character and peculiar solemnity. It would still have power had it been written in some time or place unknown and without posterity, if it contained no name that could now be recognized or identified by research. It is in fact written in a language that after many centuries has still essential kinship with our own. It was made in this land and moves in our northern world beneath our northern sky, and for those who are native to that tongue and land, it must ever call with a profound appeal until the dragon comes. It says,
Mm.
even if it wasn't Old English, if it had no bearing upon us and upon England, it is still this great example of sort of this distant echo type of poem. But it should have even more meaning for us. And let me double check where this was presented to. Yeah, to the British Academy. So he's speaking specifically to a British, English audience. And he's saying, like, you should really appreciate this thing for all that it is, not for just the distinct component parts. Don't dissect it, don't break it apart. Appreciate the poem as a whole, and you'll be much better off for it.
Well said.
Thank you. Do you have any other thoughts on the monsters and the critics?
I think I'm running out.
Yeah. Oh, that's all right.
Mm.
Yes. Well, I really enjoyed it. I don't know what you thought. Might not have been as accessible to you, not having much experience with Beowulf.
Yeah, I mean that obviously was a challenge,
Hmm.
but um, like I said, he explains his position very well.
Hmm.
I'm convinced, even though I haven't read the darn thing for like 35 years or whatever it was. Not even enough to remember the name of the hall or anything. So I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage, but
Hmm.
yeah, it was neat. It was good.
Yeah. Well, I hope this format kind of works.
We'll go
Uh,
through it
yeah.
fast
Yeah.
because we're gonna go through.
Yeah, there's only seven. Seven essays, I think is the actual number. I think that's right. But yeah, the next one will be on translating Beowulf. Yeah, just seven, and then Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, talking about that great Middle English work, and then the most important one, I think the best one, is smack dab in the middle on fairy stories, and that's the one that the paper I just gave focused most on. All of English and Welsh, a secret vice, and then the valedictory address at the end, which that one. Yeah, you might get more out of that one in the end, but on fairy stories, I think is very accessible too.
Yeah, right. Well, I don't know if we'll be doing our podcast on um, Trans Visibility Day or not, but we read about fairy story. Wait, what?
That's it's a different thing that he's
Oh,
talking about there.
he wasn't making disparaging comments about.
No, I don't think so. I don't
Oh,
think so.
well, neither was I.
No.
I don't know why you were thinking that.
Oh yeah, no, I don't.
You're a bigot. You gotta do that stuff to your mother all the time.
That's. I'm
I'll,
sure
I'll
she enjoys that.
do a play on words, and she's like,
Mhm.
"You can't say that. What are you talking about?" Oh, you mean that?
Oh my gosh. All right. Well, do you have any closing thoughts you want to end with here?
No.
All right. Well, this has been season 11, episode 1 of Unlimited Opinions. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.